Okay, so thanks for this. Jay Pearson is a professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy. I'm also a faculty member there. Dr. Pearson is an expert in the impact of race on health, and he, among other things, and he and I both grew up in Eastern North Carolina, and the more we've gotten to know each other, the more we've come to understand there are aspects of our lives that were really similar, but then there are other aspects that are really different, and race is a big part of those. And so, we're just going to have a conversation about that tonight. So Jay, thanks for being willing to do this. I know putting yourself out there on a topic like this, it can be scary, and I appreciate you doing that.
Thank you, Don, for having me this evening.
So Jay, I think one thing folks sometimes ask me is, what's the difference between racism and structural racism?
Yeah.
And how do we get this language straight so we can learn to talk to each other more clearly?
Yeah, it's an important distinction. And structural racism, as we know it in contemporary U.S. society, is a set of social arrangements, relationships, and conditions that are systemically advantageous to majority population whites, while being simultaneously systemically disadvantageous to minority populations of color. And structural racism holds that macro level processes associated with racial construction, racial hierarchy, as well as racial bias are or were central organizing features of the nation that were established before its formal founding and that remain salient to the U.S. social order even until today. These are multifaceted, interconnected, and co-occurring phenomena. This means that structural racism is inextricably linked to U.S. national identity. It pervades and suffuses virtually every major institution comprising U.S. society and is consequently systemic. As such, it negatively impacts and determines the life chances and lived experiences of U.S. populations of color to the benefit of white Americans, far beyond what most people think of as racism, which is interpersonal discrimination, right? Mm-hmm. And, those of us who do this work argue that this is who we are, is who we've been, again, since before the inception of the nation, and current animated protest against overt, gross, dehumanizing racial injustice in the form of homicide against Black men and women, notwithstanding, who we are likely to continue being without similarly animated policy changes in our political, economic, educational, academic, policing, carceral, and not least of these, legal justice systems.
So I think a lot of times white people especially think of racists or racism as people, white people doing nasty things, shouting white power, or folks marching around with rebel flags and things like that. And here the difference is interpersonal, person-to-person harm, negative words. We might think of that as racism or racist acts, but here we're talking about things that are so embedded in society that we might not even be aware of them, and because of that, they actually affect many more people. I think of an analogy like if you're making a cake and you've got some vanilla, for example. The vanilla, it kind of tastes sort of funny by itself, but when you put vanilla into a cake mix and it gets in there with the flour and the eggs and the butter, it has a flavor that's in every single bite. And even though you can't, really identify the vanilla per se. And so if I were going to restate, I think if I've got this right, structural racism is in every bite of America at some level. And that just shows how pervasive an issue it is.
Yeah, I think that's right, Don. I think of Ellison's invisible man, and they make a similar analogy there, right? So I think you got it right. I think that's it. Yeah.
So let me ask you, can you think of, you and I both, we've talked a lot about, our backgrounds growing up. Can you think of an example or a time when you experienced harm from this structural racism?
Yeah. So, I referenced that social bias is one dimension, and social bias is both positive and negative. And so I'll share an example with you of how I had an experience with negative social bias. When I was 12 years old, I got a job working in cucumber fields. And the guy who recruited us to come out came into my neighborhood, and my brother and my closest friends and some of our cousins all agreed to go out and work in the field. And we were told that we would be paid every day at the end of the day. And, agricultural work, this kind of agricultural work is piecework. You get paid by the bushel basket.
Right.
So at the end of the first day, we didn't get paid. And the field manager told us that we had misunderstood and that we were going to get paid on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. So I went back on Tuesday. My brother and my closest friend didn't come back. I went back. I worked Tuesday, didn't get paid. Was told I would get paid on Wednesday. Worked Wednesday, still didn't get paid. And so I finished out the week with the expectation that on Friday I was going to get paid. By my count, I had earned $92. When I went to collect my pay, I got paid $17. That $75 difference, in my humble estimation, was worth fighting over. And so I spoke to the woman who was sort of the person who was at the counting station, and I matched my books against hers. And she was slightly embarrassed and said, well, I can't do anything about this. You're going to have to talk to Robert Lee. And Robert Lee Williams, a Black man, was the person who had come into the community to recruit us and was driving the bus that took us to the fields every day. And Robert Lee said to me, well, Jay, you're going to have to take this up with Mr. Percy, because you know how we are. We might be out here pretending that we're working, but not really working. And so I suspect Mr. Percy's trying to make sure that you're actually putting in the work. So if you talk to him, maybe you can get this straight.
And so did he mean we? This is a Black man talking about Black people. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, one of the manifestations of structural racism is internalization, where those who are negatively targeted actually adapt and believe the negative portrayals, the less than ideal portrayals about themselves. And Robert Lee was displaying that and explaining to me what had happened. So I went in the following Monday and confronted Captain Percy, as they call him where I'm from, and explained to him what had happened. And he said to me, well, if you want to get paid more, you're going to have to work harder, because this is good work for people like you, and I'm not giving you any more money. And I say it's good work because if you weren't out here working in my fields, you would be at home on welfare with your mother collecting my tax money.
So he's making a, often people talk about a hierarchy of human value that's often been marked by race in U.S. history. And so he had put you in a box where he had decided what you were worth.
Yeah. And so he'd already determined, you hit it on the head, my market value, and I was going to be compensated at that rate, completely independent of how hard I had worked, right? And so that's one component. And so this notion of the meritocracy gets exploded because clearly I had worked, and everyone, Robert Lee and Ms. Mabel both agreed that I had put the work in, but Mr. Percy was not going to compensate me. So that's one component. The other component is that the power dynamics that characterize the position that Mr. Percy occupied in the community that I grew up in versus the one that I occupied were such that there was nothing in any practical sense that I could do to defend myself, right? And so the value of that experience is that I took that lesson with me and I hold on to it. And in many ways, it guided my commitment to do well in the classroom and quite frankly, influences the work that I do now in my research and my teaching and in my advocacy. This notion of this hierarchy of human evaluation and what happens when someone who's relegated to an inferior position performs beyond their position.
Right. And what's so horrible about that story is, meritocracy in a university context can be kind of complicated to measure, but meritocracy, picking cucumbers, is pretty straightforward, right? I mean, right. You can measure it in bushel baskets. So you actually could have a totally meritocratic pay system for picking cucumbers, just I'm going to pay for however many pounds you pick. And I think that sounds like it's actually the way in which you were coaxed into the job. And then, basically, this man was able to take advantage of you because of, differential power.
You got it. Well, Don, can I ask you, so you're from Northeastern North Carolina. I wonder if you have any experiences in terms of racial identity and experiences with structural racism.
Yeah, I've been, as we've talked some, I've been writing a book that's actually turned into really kind of a memoir of race, which is a weird thing, I think, to be writing. I think memoirs are kind of self-indulgent, but this one, I think it's been a great project for me. And as I was thinking about structural racism, as we were talking, it brought to mind an incident that I probably hadn't thought about in maybe 30 years. One of these things that came back. And in May of my senior year in high school, May of 1986, I got caught skipping school. And I don't even remember what it was about. Like, I'm not even sure why I was skipping school or what I was doing. I mean, the school year is basically over. I'm skipping school, whatever, I get caught. And so I'm thinking I could be in some pretty bad hot water because Pat Best was the principal, a Black man, a pretty strong disciplinarian. So I'm thinking, I really could be in for it. I wonder what he's going to do. And when I walked into his office, what he said, as I think back on it, really kind of horrifies me. And part of what horrifies me is because I didn't think anything much of it at the time. But what Mr. Best said was, he said, Don, please don't put me in a bad situation like this again before you graduate. He was almost kind of like pleading with me, don't do something bad because I don't want to be understood to be giving you preferential treatment, even though I am now going to give you preferential treatment. And so he basically did nothing. And in many ways, at the time, I just thought, oh, I must have got away with something, and I just sort of stumbled on. But when I think back, that was me receiving benefit because I was a white guy. In particular, the context of the Goldsboro City Schools is Wayne County is about 50-50 Black, white back then. And the lines were gerrymandered to produce like a 75% Black city school system and the opposite, 75% white county school system. And there was a lot of, I was in the city school system. So there were just, in retrospect, there were so many, differential benefits of the doubt and second and third and fourth and fifth chances. So that's an example of, I would not have had the language of structural racism. If you'd have said that to me in 1986, I would have said, what? And even, but I think that's one of the hallmarks of how this works. It's not just negative impacts on that are not warranted, but it's also positive impacts also that are not warranted, and sometimes operate so much in the background that I think white people either aren't aware of them or maybe there's selective amnesia and we try to forget about them. But in many ways, that story at some level is kind of the opposite of the story that you just told. You did the right thing, didn't get paid appropriately. I did something that was wrong and nothing, really happened. I don't know, that's an example of it.
Yeah. Well, Don, you literally just defined discrimination an unincurred disadvantage, and privilege, an unearned advantage. And, you know, the other thing that occurs to me as you were relating your story and I was thinking about mine was I was very much aware in the moment of what was happening, and it left an indelible imprint on my sense of self and my worldview moving forward. Yeah. Were you aware as this happened to you that, you know, that you were benefiting from some unearned advantage?
I don't think so. I don't really remember. I wasn't the most thoughtful 18-year-old boy. Right. So I was mostly like, I'm into myself. I'm getting ready to go to college. I think I probably just thought, I got away with something there. Right. But I don't, the thing that I think of now when I think of that is embarrassment but because actually Mr. Best was, I think, a great principal and a nice fella, and he supported the football team, and he came, I liked him a lot. And so it actually does make me feel bad that I put him in a bad situation. But, in fact, I got caught, and I just ended up, getting by with something when I'm pretty, sure that a black guy, would not have gotten away with, something would have happened. So, and that makes me think too, I know our colleague, Sherman James, writing about John Henryism, that this process of striving against these negative, sort of penalties of structural racism actually does, biological things to us. So I was able to experience the benefit without thinking one way or another about it. But, it sounds like for you probably experienced anger, rage, whatever, and that actually has physical effects.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so that's correct. In fact, when I read about John Henryism in 1989, when I was an undergrad over at NCCU, along with a couple of other experiences that I had in school, I immediately thought about that cucumber story. So that's right. Don, can I ask you another question? So, one of the dimensions of structural racism is racial construction or racial identity construction. At what point did you become aware of racial identity? Or, I should ask, are you aware? And if so, at what point did you become aware?
Yes, so I'm now aware that I'm a white man. That sounds like not the biggest, that may not sound like a shocking thing, but if I would have heard the word or the phrase identity politics, probably even as long as within the last 7 or 8 years, I would have thought of identity politics as what Black folks try to do, or LGBTQ folks, or Hispanic folks, or people that are trying to, push some particular point of view. I might even agree with that point of view and think what they were talking about was just, but I came to realize that I actually understood myself to be absent of identity. I was just me. And I realized that my daughter, she and I have talked about this, and she says, well, Dad, part of that's because you were a man as well, which I think is true. So, both race and gender are doing something here. But I guess for me, that when we were talking about like the bite of the cake and it's in there and you don't even see it, the thing about the beneficial side of structural racism, that's the unwarranted favor to white folks or people that are passing as white, is that you don't have to think about it or lay claim to it often to receive the advantage, and you sort of turn your own perspective into the ultimate default. It's everything compared to whatever I think. Again, thinking back in this story, in the summer of 1989, I spent the summer in Pakistan, and I really stood out there. So I was in this rural place, and so when I'd walk around, people would be looking at, why is that big white dude walking around here? And by the way, if you would have given me a census document, I would have checked white or Caucasian or whatever. I'm not saying like I was somehow
Right.
in some kind, but I didn't think of white as being an identity. I just thought of it as the default. I just thought in myself. But anyway, when the summer I was in Pakistan, it's kind of a haggle culture. So everything is, like you go buy apricots and the taxi ride, there's nothing, the price of nothing is nailed down. Everything is, up for discussion. And often sometimes, anytime the foreigner comes, you're not going to get the best price, whatever. And I found myself being much more aggressive in these interactions than I would be, just by my personality is usually pretty laid back. And sometimes would even get angry with folks. And I also came to understand that whenever I went down the street, like just to do anything, people would just look. And I'm kind of an introverted private person. And so there's a lot of stress for people just looking at me all the time. And so that was in 1989. So that was a glimpse of the reality, I think, of Black folk in the United States, with people looking twice when they go into a store or whatever, looking twice to say, why are you in this neighborhood? But I just didn't have the insight to bring that back at that time. It just, a lot of these things just make sense in retrospect now. But I think it just means that especially if you're a white man and you're, from a upper middle class family, you just don't need to worry. You don't have to bump in to what your identity is, really. You just can kind of live your life and get away without having to think about it.
Yeah. So there's a protection if it's the normative view, right?
The
normative view. That's interesting, Don.
So tell us about what's your identity? When did you become aware these types of things?
Yeah, I think I was aware pretty early on. I grew up in a household with a father who is from Halifax County, North Carolina, and identifies with the Halawasa people. And so I was very much aware of that Native heritage, and a mother who self-identifies as Black American. And so for the first 11 years of my life, we lived out on a farm away from folks. And my dad and his uncle, my great uncle Jesse, had a lot of influence on particularly my brother. I have a brother and a sister, both younger, on my socialization and that of my brothers. And then when we were 11, we moved off of the farm into an all-Black trailer park. And the kids there let us know in no uncertain terms that we were and could only be Black, right? And so for the first 11 years of my life, I got to sort of occupy this dual identity. And it was happening, but it didn't seem abnormal or anything out of the ordinary. I was one thing with my dad's side of the family and something different with my mother's side of the family. But but the kids there, literally said, we're not dealing with any Geronimos.
So basically, these kids needed for the world to be simple as Black, white, and the kind of the complexity just made things too difficult to navigate.
You got it.
When you say that, sometimes scholars will say it's social construction of race, and people will say, "Oh man, why are you guys talking about these weird, crazy topics?" But what you just talked about is that it's just that one side of the family identifies this way, one side there, the other way, and you move somewhere else, the students or the other kids are there. I mean that's just a human thing. It's not something that scholars have invented.
I agree, Don. And then for me, it got accelerated and cast in really sharp relief when I finished undergrad. I joined the Peace Corps, and I finished in 91 and went to live in Honduras. And in the village where I worked, they'd had 2 prior Peace Corps volunteers, both white American. They had never seen a person of color from the States in real life. And so when I got there, they were really curious about me and asked where I was from and what I was. And I said, well, I'm from the States and I'm a health educator. They were like, no. We mean your race your ethnicity? And I said, oh, I'm Black. And they said, what? Black? You're not Black. You're 𝐃𝐮𝐤𝐈. The Black people live on the North Coast and they have straight African descent. You are clearly mixed with something. Look at your skin, look at your lips, look at your nose. And so in Honduras, at the time, they had 27 different skin color gradations that determined sort of the social stratification system, or the system of social stratification. And they were attempting to help me by encouraging me to aspire to my highest possible color status.
So I could be something help you jump up some categories.
That's right. I could be something other than Black. And so I think that that had implications for my experience in Honduras, how I was received. And, you know, I learned Spanish when I was there. And then I came back to the States. Now I have Spanish. I was really comfortable with or engaging and negotiating Latin American culture when I was there. And so that's something that manifested when I came back to the States that had never, you know, I hadn't had that before. And so I come back here and I have another race/ethnicity national origin that I can call upon in certain situations. I've lived in Florida and other places, and it's something that I've been able to tap into. And so the lesson that I learned from that is that these social identity construction processes, right, are context specific. Mm-hmm. How we get perceived, how we respond, and the set of resources that we have access to or risk that we have to contend with vary contingent upon the social situation that we find ourselves in, right?
Yeah, and who belongs where and who decides. You know, that reminds me of another story that's actually in my book. I signed up late for a conference. So the conference hotel was sold out. So I stayed in the Ritz-Carlton in Philadelphia. Okay. So, you know, all that hotel. And I when I go to other cities, I like to get a local paper and just, you know, sort of check it out. And so I was coming downstairs and I had on this kind of gray sort of disheveled wool toboggan and overcoat. It was kind of flurrying a little bit. And it's what my children call my homeless guy look. And I stumbled out the side door, or went out the side door to get the newspaper, and I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot to bring my key. So I was like, man, I don't exactly look like the Ritz, okay? But anyway, so I got my paper and I went in and strode into the Ritz, and I just went ahead and went in because I knew that I belonged there, and people let me in, and I, you know, went in, even though I really didn't look like I belonged, other than being a, you know, white guy. And I got a cup of coffee and a muffin, and I'm sitting there reading the paper. And about 10 minutes later, this elegant Black man comes in, and he's wearing a navy suit and a red tie and this electric blue scarf. So he just looked kind of perfect. Okay. So he looked like the Ritz, right? This is the Ritz, what it looks like. And as I was just sitting there and I watched him going across the lobby, and I think you know probably what happened. I saw 4 or 5 people say, "Can I help you?" And he didn't need any help. I mean, he didn't like he needed any help. He wasn't like looking around or looking for his watch or room. It was that, "Can I help you?" The question of, do you belong in this space? Do you belong in this space? So I think that's a way where, like, that's an example where the whiteness overcame looking disheveled, like you don't belong in the Ritz. And, you know, the Black man wasn't denied access to the Ritz, but man, he had to jump these extra things. And when I think about that now, like, I wonder, was he mad? Was he numb to it? You know, I just don't know. But these things are so, these structures are so deep in our society that there's that kind of thing happens over and over again. And I suspect it affects all of us in ways that we're not even fully, you know, aware of.
Yeah.